Take a look at our winter forecast. Everybody always wants to know, will my area be cold? Will it be snowy? What are the details for this upcoming season? So, Doug, let's dive right into that. Which areas of Canada can folks expect to be coldest relative to normal?
Well, I think the focus of winter this year will be across the West. But I want to highlight the fact that, last year the entire country got off very easy. It was the warmest winter on record across Canada. I think winter's going to show up this year, and everyone's going to see a colder winter than last year. But the focus of the cold, as we get into the heart of the season, January and February should be across the West. But that's really not the case in December. We're actually going to see more widespread cold. Even the East is going to get into some traditional winter weather.
All right, so great news for winter lovers that it is going to sort of start with a bang. All right, that's the cold. What about the snow? Which areas of the country are going to have to be digging out throughout the season?
Well, two areas we're highlighting in southern BC and into southwestern parts of the prairies. Ski areas will be happy in BC. And then into southern Alberta, and then an active storm track into the Great Lakes we think will bring above average snow across much of northern Ontario and into western Quebec.
Okay, so that's good news. And you mentioned the ski areas, a lot of those places last year, a bit of a struggle for their season. So they'll be happy to know that some more typical Canadian winter conditions are on the way. Let's talk a little bit about forecast confidence right now. Which are the areas of what we're talking about today that you are most confident in, or by the same token, least confident?
Well, overall, in terms of winter showing up this year and being that we're not going to repeat last year, confidence is high. And the overall idea that the focus of the cold during January and February is in the West, that's pretty moderate to high. The question is, does the West just see more of a normal winter and the East is mild? Or does cold take over more, and then the West actually is colder than normal, and that bleeds east, and while it's milder, it's still near normal. So the magnitude of the cold is still uncertain. The fact that it's colder than last year, well, of that we are fairly confident.
And we'll also have to remember that just because you see on your map above average temperatures, that still means cold. Average temperatures throughout the winter are cold.
Right, so we're not talking above average in a historical way like last year. And in many parts of Canada, you can be warmer than normal and still cold enough to snow. If your average high is -5, it's -2, it's still snowing. So we're just not talking about persistent severe cold like you might see in many winters, but winter is going to show up.
Okay, will winter show up in time for Christmas? A lot of people, with the release of this forecast, always want to know. We're getting closer to that time of year, and especially last year, where we saw a lot of areas that typically see a white Christmas, see a green Christmas. I think some people are saying, I want to get back to what I'm used to. What are we looking at for that?
Well, I do think we're going to see a much more widespread Christmas this year. I mean, December is the month that will likely be the coldest relative to normal and the most widespread cold relative to normal. So, I mean, there's a lot of areas where you typically have a 50-50 chance, and those areas where it's still going to come down to the weather during the week of Christmas. But places that typically see a white Christmas that missed out last year, I think you will see a white Christmas this year, and it'll be a much more widespread snow cover than last year.
All right, so the picturesque snowy scenes that we are accustomed to seeing, we are hopeful that we'll return to those conditions once again this year. Well, we have spent much of the fall leading up to the release of our winter forecast monitoring whether we will return to a La Niña pattern for this winter. And Doug, a lot of signs over the last weeks and months were pointing in that direction, but now as we release the forecast, it looks like that's not quite going to be the case. So give us a La Niña update for this season.
Well, through the fall, we've had La Niña conditions. In order to get an official classification, you have to meet a temperature threshold, then it has to stick around for several months. And so we haven't met the duration requirement. But the expectation was as we went into winter, we would officially be in a weak La Niña. But we're seeing signs that La Niña is actually, those conditions are fading.
Okay.
And we may never get a classification. We may just stay in neutral conditions. Now, that's not actually a huge deal to the winter forecast. The atmosphere doesn't wait for press releases declaring it's La Niña. It responds to changes in ocean water temperatures. We've had weak conditions, but if that really fades through the winter, it will have some impact on how the winter evolves.
What will that impact be?
Well, then it means we don't have a strong driver of the weather pattern. And so other variables around the globe will interact with each other. And it becomes very important, regardless of the classification, where the coolest versus warmest water is found in the tropical Pacific. Even in a neutral pattern, if the water is warmer close to South America, that's a much warmer signal for eastern Canada, cold in the west. If it's the other way around, it's the other way around. So we'll be watching to see where these cool and warm pockets of water emerge and evolve as the season progresses.
What are some of the other factors that you look at when we're trying to determine what the forecast is going to be for the season? I think about, one of the popular terms is the polar vortex.
Right.
So that's an example. What other things are you looking at to sort of help figure out what the season's going to look like?
Well, you start looking at ocean water temperatures in other areas that can influence where the trough ridge pattern will set up in the jet stream pattern and whether it will lock into place or whether it'll be changeable. And the polar vortex, is it going to be organized over the pole? Will it get displaced? If it gets displaced, will it be over on the Asia side of the pole or will it be on the North American side of the pole? As we go into December, the polar vortex is coming to North America, which is why we're going to see much more widespread cold across Canada. So as we get into the season, we're trying to figure out how the polar vortex will behave. That's always important, but now you're lacking kind of a strong driver to influence it. It increases the risk that the forecast doesn't develop quite as you expect or that there are some important changes.
And I guess one of the themes of the entire forecast for the season that varies from last year is that just a lot more cold air in the neighborhood this year that really prevented winter from kicking off last year.
Right. Last year we had a strong El Niño. That was the dominant pattern driver. It just took over and it flooded the country with mild air most of the season. This year we know winter is going to show up. There is going to be cold air. The question is it focused primarily in the west? Does it shift east? Does it just sprawl and take over the pattern?
So a lot of variables that go into the creation of this winter forecast. So what we see as the forecast gets released, not always what we're necessarily going to lock into. So we continue to monitor the long-term forecasts in the days and weeks ahead. Seasonal forecasts in general can be quite difficult to create. I think we should acknowledge that. You're the author of the seasonal forecast, so we'll give you that we don't hold you to everything, all of the details. We know that you do your best. What are some of the challenges in creating a seasonal forecast and specifically a winter forecast?
Well, the key is we're just trying to get a snapshot of the season as a whole. We can't give you the day-to-day details or whether it'll be a white Christmas or not just yet. But, is cold going to dominate or will it be historically warm like last year? And the key is we look at dominant pattern drivers around the globe. And ocean water temperatures, so important. And you may have heard the term El Niño or La Niña. Those patterns have a big impact in the jet stream. And so, as we look at an upcoming season, we look back at history at years that had similar patterns. Where it gets really challenging, though, is sometimes the pattern changes, the anticipated pattern changes as you go through the season. I use a sports analogy. You make a prediction on your favorite team based on the players that you expect to have all season. You get a couple critical injuries to your star players, everything changes.
Yeah, it's all out the window.
And if one of your dominant pattern drivers changes, then of course the season will change and not evolve as expected.
Right. So what factors do you examine in season that could have one of those big changes on the forecast?
So last year we had a strong El Niño, and so it made it an easier forecast. We knew it was the dominant pattern driver, and there's some known impacts. And then La Niña is the opposite of that, when you have colder than normal ocean water temperatures in the tropical Pacific. Now this year we're in a neutral to weak La Niña, which means we really don't have a dominant pattern driver. It means subtle changes in water temperatures of the ocean in different parts of the globe or in the behavior of the polar vortex can really take over the season and really throw the forecast off.
You talked about analog years, precedent years that you rely on, you look to when creating the new forecast. Does the changing climate have a significant impact on whether there are the same number of analog years, or if there are years that have all of the same characteristics? Is it making it more difficult?
The challenge is that, with the warmer ocean water temperatures, it kind of limits your sample size, because you can, I can't look back at El Niños 50, 60 years ago and see how that influenced the pattern, because we're just dealing with a warmer ocean now than we did then. So it kind of limits the sample size, and it increases the possibility that you have a global pattern setup that you haven't seen before. That pattern setup may not be because of climate change, but it means that we can't really look back at years, say 50 years ago, and analyze what those patterns produce. So we're definitely seeing some setups in the global pattern. You're like, no, I don't have a precedence in the past to really look at. So you have to, you got a lot of pieces of the puzzle. It's sometimes hard to figure out how they all come together.
Right. A good reminder that forecasting, even the short range, can be quite difficult. There are a lot of factors at play that we have to consider, and when we expand the range that we're forecasting for weeks and months in advance, that it just changes the variables so much and makes things a lot more difficult. Yes. So Doug does an excellent job with the seasonal forecasts. Please do not direct your complaints specifically to Doug for any particular seasonal forecast.